Hello, I'm Binet, and I'd like to talk about how to adapt your marketing strategy to the current crisis. Now, we know quite a lot about how brands should navigate their way through a recession. We know that brands that can afford to maintain their advertising, that can afford to maintain their share of voice, can emerge from a recession stronger than ever. And so our usual advice at times like these is don't go dark. But I'm not quite sure that that advice, based on research from previous recessions, applies right now in its raw form. There are a couple of reasons for this. The first is simply this is not a normal recession. This is a pandemic. This is a humanitarian crisis. In many ways, this is more like a war than a recession. There will be a recession. We're probably going into recession now, but that's only part of what's going on. And the second reason why I think we need a more nuanced approach to all this is that different businesses are facing very different problems. Some businesses are actually thriving right now. Others are completely shut down. I don't believe there's a one-size-fits-all solution to this crisis. Rather than give you some simple rules or a simple pronouncement about what you should do, I'd like to outline a framework for thinking about how to respond and how to adapt your marketing strategy so that you can survive, adapt, and ultimately recover stronger than before. So I'm going to talk about how businesses need to manage supply and demand, how businesses need to use all four of the marketing P's to keep supply and demand together and in sync. And I'm going to talk a bit about the role of advertising within that and how to adapt your advertising strategy. But first, I think we need to really understand why this crisis is different from a normal recession. Now, it's been a very long time since we faced a crisis of this magnitude. Most marketers alive today have never experienced anything like this. And so it's obvious and understandable that they should turn to history as a guide to how to behave. And there's an obvious place to look. We have a big body of research on previous recessions. There's research that goes all the way back to the 1920s on how brands should behave and how they should adapt their marketing strategy. And that's an obvious place to look. And it is a useful resource when tailoring your marketing strategy to the COVID crisis. But that research needs to be interpreted with care for several reasons. The first is that this is not a normal recession. Almost all of the recessions that have affected marketing in recent history have been crises of demand. The fundamental problem is that ordinary people, consumers, haven't got enough money to spend and they're cutting back. And so firms need to find a way to stimulate demand to sell their products. And in that situation, advertising is a very important and powerful tool. But this crisis is different. The recession that we're now entering is partly a crisis of demand, but it's also a crisis of supply. And that makes things very different. For a start, it means that the recession will have a very different shape to normal. We're going into the recession very quickly. It's going to be a very sharp, deep recession, a very deep recession, much deeper than anything we've seen perhaps since the Second World War. It also makes the shape of the recovery very hard to predict. It's possible that we might have a V-shaped recovery, but it's also possible that there might be a long, slow, painful crawl back to normal. So a recession that is partly a recession of supply looks rather different to a normal recession. And as you'll see in a bit, one needs to adopt a slightly different approach to marketing in a supply-led recession. But there's another sense in which this crisis is very different, because it's not just a recession. It's a humanitarian crisis, a pandemic. Lives are at stake. And in fact, I would argue that, at least in the early phase of the crisis, we should not be thinking of this primarily as an economic problem, but as a humanitarian one. In many ways, this is more like a war than a recession.